Hello, today I'm going to share with you 4 different techniques that I use all of the time to add a bit of watercolour into my illustration work. So for this tutorial you'll need some watercolours, obviously. I've got this Winsor and Newton palette, if I can get it open, with quite a few different colours in it. And I'm going to be using my Moleskine sketchbook, which is watercolour paper inside. And I've also got a couple of brushes and some water. One of my brushes is a bit flatter, a bit bigger and fluffier, whilst the other one's a bit more dense. And here's a pressed flower I'd put in between the pages of my sketchbook, so that was a nice surprise. Not sure where to put that one, just drop it there for now. So now I found a blank page in my sketchbook. I'm going to go ahead and use the bigger brush first. Roll your sleeves up a little bit, don't forget that step. And just use some water, I guess. I was going to say plain water, yeah, just water, without any colour in it, to just give the page a light wash of water. I like to add that in a little bit first to help the paint spread a bit more. And I'm just mixing up a colour here that's quite light, and I'm just going to go in and roughly brush that all over the place in some rough sections, just spreading it out. And it just makes it a bit easier to spread if the page is wet first. And I just like the effect it has. It makes like the paint bleed a little bit more when you apply it. And this step really is all about just layering. So what I'm doing here, sorry I didn't explain that, is just creating a whole spread of watercolour that I can use in a few different ways, and it's really going to be useful for a few different techniques that I'm going to show you later on. But yeah, the first step is to create a whole A4 spread full of watercolour. Just fill it right to the edges of watercolour, and once you've got that base layer to dry a little bit, I like to go in and add another layer on top of that with some more colour. Usually use the same shade, maybe a tiny bit darker. And what I like to do is, if there's a lot of water pooling in the paper, I like to tip up the spread a little bit and spread it back out, and that creates a lot more of that water texture. So when I'm creating these spreads that are filled with watercolour, I like to kind of do a layer, leave it to dry a little bit. I'm probably not patient enough and should let it dry a little bit more in between each step, but I still like the water to be a little bit wet. It's a bit easier to work with, and I like the effect of the colour spreading within that. You can leave it to dry completely if you want, and then add in another water layer on top. And each layer I go in and I add a darker shade each time. So this is another dark shade that I'm going in and stippling a little bit of colour in, and then using some more water to spread that back out a bit. I'm just going to speed that up a little bit. You can see it's moving around a lot the more water I add, and again, I just like to tip it a little bit, create a bit more motion with the paint, and just leave it to spread around a bit. Leave that to dry a little bit more, and then add another colour. You can add in a lot of different shades if you want to create a multicoloured kind of effect, but I was kind of going for this earthy, pinky, kind of neutral palette, I guess. So I'm sticking with roughly the same shades, just a bit darker each time. So adding in a bit more brown to my pink, or a bit more yellow, and just really toning it up each time, and then just sparingly stippling that colour around in different areas, just to kind of, you don't want all of the shade to be in the same place, you want it to be spread around a bit. So I'm just like dotting that around in different areas, and there really is no like set structured technique to this as such. It's just about having fun with the paint and playing around with it and seeing what happens. That's why it's just a fun technique, really, to add it into your work, and I just find it quite therapeutic to go in and play around with the watercolour. So now I'm using my denser, shorter brush and just leaving the paint to dry a little bit more this time, so it's not as much not as much water, I guess, on this step. Like, just leave it to dry a bit more so that the paint is a little bit more set and it's not moving around as much. So I think I'm happy with where that's at now. I've got my full page of watercolour, and I'm going to go in to the opposite spread, and I'm going to use this spread to create a lot of different little pieces that again I'm going to show you at the end, well, not at the end, after I've created all my watercolour pieces, how I'm going to use that in my work. So Roughly, I like to create a page that's full of watercolour, then I like to create a lot of separate little pieces like these. So I'll create some rough shapes like this one where I'll just add in a light tone, like a splodge of watercolour, splash of watercolour, just a rough organic shape really, and then go in again with a similar technique of what we've just done for the opposite full spread and leave it to dry a little bit. Add in a darker tone over the top of that, watch it spread out a bit, dry again, add in a darker tone, just on a smaller scale. So I'm going to create a few of those, and really just you want it to be as organic as possible. So if it's looking a bit structured on the edges or a bit a bit straight, you just want to kind of go in and add a little bit more paint to the edge just to fluff it out a bit, smudge it up a bit. And yeah, just going in with the darker tones. It's quite cool to see it spread up actually in the water moving around the page like that. So finishing that off with some tiny little stipply brush strokes with my darker colour, and I've got some nice little splashes of watercolour there. And I've got a tutorial actually that I'll link below as well that's quite nice at that step, is to sprinkle some rock salt on until it dries. That creates a nice textured effect as well that I'll share more info on. So I've got a bit more space on my spread, so I'm going to add some rough shapes in, and these look quite random, which they are. Again, it's another fun way to just create some random bits and bobs to dot around any illustrations you like. I find them useful to have in my library because you never know when you want to add a bit of colour, but you don't want to add a block colour or just like little flourishes, little details. So just create whatever you fancy here. I'm just creating some brush strokes, and then layering in some colour over the top, some little stamps, some smaller blotches of colour, and just really playing around with the shape of the brush and the brush strokes and seeing what happens really. Once the paint starts to dry a bit on the brush, just using what's left over to create some lighter effects as well. And I'm going to scan that all in, making sure to press your sketchbook down so it's all flat against the screen. And in Photoshop, you're going to remove the background and separate all these little pieces out and organise them into your library in Adobe if you do that, or just keep them on file. I'll link another video again to show you my techniques for that as well. So let's get straight into using these watercolours. So first off, you can use it as a background and layer some artwork on top of that. That already has the white filled in behind it, so it's literally a straight background. Or you can use it with some outlines, so you can see the watercolour between the lines, which works quite nice. My favourite way though is to drop that layer in front of your drawing and create a clip and mask. Just right click and select clip and mask, and as you can see the watercolour behind the illustration now, where all those black lines were. You can now see the watercolour, which I think is a really pretty effect, and you can move it around to see where's best to put it, or as I'm doing, I'm adjusting the curves and dropping them down ever so slightly to make the watercolour stand out a bit more and it's a bit darker, but I think that's a really pretty technique to use, and I use that quite often. These are some pieces that I've used that in, like these feathers here within my patterns, that was using a multicoloured watercolour background, and just layering those feathers on top of each other and multiplying the layers and just seeing how they show through. So yeah, these ones I used a lot of different colours and it worked really well for that. So yeah, that's just one example of how you can use those watercolours. Well, two with the background, one with that. Okay, another way is to drop in these splodges and drop them behind your drawing, and they make a really pretty background behind anything. If you want to create a spot illustration, just a one-off thing like this, or just to add a bit of colour behind, I think that works so pretty. As well, you could just create this watercolour splodge and then draw directly on top of it with a flower of your choice or anything that you'd like to draw. So let's try another one. Let's maybe try a sun. And again, you can drop something behind that. One of these watercolour splodges works best for that, and I just kind of like to experiment and just see what works, but they're always useful to have in your library anyway, just to quickly add into some work. So you can see that looks quite cute with the uneven lines behind the sun, and you can adjust the watercolour as well, so I'm just adjusting the brightness a bit just to make it a bit lighter behind my drawing. Okay, so let's have a look at what we've tried so far. So here's the watercolour within the lines, a little bit of a splodge behind. So that's two of the techniques so far, as well as using it as a background. So I'm going to grab a little planet now and try another technique. So here's one I drew earlier. And we're going to go in with the splodges again. And I'm going to add that behind my little planet that I've just drawn. And again, if you've got like a water paper texture as your background, you can multiply that layer and have the paper texture show through from the background. And I'm going to rasterize that layer and use my eraser tool to rub out all of the bits of watercolour peeking out from behind my little illustration, just to tidy it up a bit. So again, it can be quite nice to have a bit of the watercolour shown around the outside of your drawing, or you can try it like this where it's a bit neater and it only shows behind the areas you actually want it to be behind, and you can control where it sits a bit more. So I'm just going to rub out everywhere that the watercolour appears outside of my drawing. I think that creates a nice little watercolour-y planet effect, which works a lot better sometimes than just colouring it digitally, or just hand painting it. It's just something a little bit different, isn't it? Don't forget to rub it out on any of the bits inside your drawing that you don't want it on as well. And again, you can adjust these layers, adjust the saturation if you want to change the colour slightly. You can see it's changing more than that as well, so don't forget to create a clip and mask, and it'll only affect the layer below that you want it to. So now you can see it's only having an effect on that planet illustration. Okay, next we're going to show you a way to use all of these little details. So I'm just going to dot some around a flower, just as a rough example. So I love adding these little brush strokes coming off the side of some illustrations, and I'm going to add in some lighter ones as well, just to add in a bit of decoration, a bit of something different. And I'll show you an example of where I've used this before. In this illustration here, you can see all those colourful brush strokes. That's real watercolour using the technique I've just shown you and dotted into my work.